Imagine that there is a place where the most important officials of the Nazi Empire seek the ultimate pleasure that their pockets can afford. It is a realm of unimaginable fantasies, where the darkest perversions of Hitler's lieutenants come to life. The most beautiful women of Europe are there, ready to fulfill all their desires in exchange for an exorbitant price. Not everyone can afford a visit here, but those who can always come back. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you everything about Les Chabanais, the luxurious brothel of the Nazi leaders. To understand this story, we have to go back to the early stages of the Second World War. In the year 1940, the forces of the Third Reich seemed unbeatable, and everyone watched with a mix of horror and amazement as Europe fell under Hitler's grip. The Führer's troops took over France at an incredible speed. The Gauls were disorganized, and their army failed to halt the formidable German panzers in any way. The defense was a complete failure, resulting in the military conquest of the nation, which was divided into two parts. On one side, the military occupation zone was established in the north, administered by the Germans. On the other side, in the south, Vichy France was established, a collaborationist state eager to gain favor with the Nazis. Next, we will listen to the moment when France's leader announces the surrender to his people.
J'ai demandé à nos adversaires de mettre fin aux hostilités. J'ai pris cette décision dure au cœur d'un soldat, parce que la situation militaire l'imposait.
Although this was a tragedy for the population, for prostitutes, the German invasion marked the beginning of their golden age. Never before was there such a demand for sex workers in France, to the point that they became one of the most benefited social groups during that period. It is interesting that in Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich, brothels were strictly prohibited. Hitler had deemed prostitution an immoral profession, whose only purpose was to plunge the Aryan race into decadence. Those who practiced it were considered criminals and were consequently harshly pursued by the police. However, the Nazis did not apply these same policies in the conquered territories. In fact, in these places, prostitution was not only allowed, but also managed by the authorities of the military occupation. The German army dared to contradict the Führer's words, arguing that prostitutes were necessary for the soldiers. They believed that men, being away from home and subjected to the constant pressure of war and military life, needed to satisfy their desires to maintain high morale. Nevertheless, this did not mean that the troops could freely mingle with any streetwalker. There were strict rules regulating their sexual behavior. The Wehrmacht classified brothels into two different categories. On one hand, there were garrison brothels located in larger cities, defined by having more occupation troops and, consequently, a higher demand for sex workers. On the other hand, there were field brothels located in the rear of the battle lines. A man exhausted from a combat that extended over several days could request special leave from his officers. During his brief leave, he was allowed to visit field prostitutes to relieve stress. For commanders, it was a way to keep the men happy and focused, as well as a means to prevent them from falling into despair and deserting. In France, the immediate consequence of the German invasion was a shortage of prostitutes. Upon learning that the Germans were heading there, many fled the country out of fear of what might happen to them. After all, in Berlin, their colleagues were vigorously persecuted, giving them good reason to be afraid. When the military governor appointed by the Wehrmacht learned that there were few prostitutes, his initial reaction was to blame the resistance. He denounced it as a plot by anti-Nazi guerrillas, seeking to undermine the morale of the Germans. However, the solution to this problem came within a few weeks when the invaders established high remunerations for prostitutes. They could earn more money providing sexual services than in any other job. To make matters better, they were sometimes paid with luxury goods such as jewelry, paintings, or high-quality food. This was the case when a prostitute became the protégé of some important officer. The protection of the conquerors was crucial and not insignificant in those uncertain times when the Nazis were ruling France. Fortunately for brothel enthusiasts, they had the famous Guia Rosa, Pink Guide, a popular book containing information about all the brothels in France. Let's take a look at what an edition of this guide was like.
Eh bien, le petit livre rose, c'est-à-dire que c'était le guide. Le guide rose, c'était l'espèce de gomillot des bordels. Alors, guide rose, annuaire indicateur des maisons et salons de société, maisons de massage et de rendez-vous de Paris, province et colonies, 1934. Alors là, d'abord, il y a évidemment des publicités de toutes sortes pour les préservatifs, la lingerie spécialisée. Il y a même un peu de publicité pour les pêcheurs, ce qui prouve que les tauliers sûrement se livraient à ce genre de distraction.
In this context, the brothel that became the most coveted place for Nazi officers was Le Chabanais in Paris. This establishment had opened its doors in 1878 at 12 Rue Chabanais, the street that gave it its name. Although its origins are shrouded in the mists of time, it is known to have been founded by an Irish woman known as Madame Kelly. This woman had significant connections in the Jockey Club of Paris, an institution for elite men. Through them, she secured investors to buy a 7-story building and turn it into a center of lust and exoticism. The facade was unassuming, so an unsuspecting person walking by would never imagine what was happening inside. However, there was a curious sign at the entrance, announcing that it was a house of all nations. This didn't mean that the prostitutes came from various countries, but that there were themed rooms designed to transport clients to different eras and parts of the world. The most famous rooms were the Arabian, Hindu, Japanese, medieval, Pompeian, and Louis XVI rooms. In total, there were 20 rooms and just under 30 prostitutes, selected from the most beautiful women in Europe. The site stood out for its luxury, and it was evident that the investors had spent a fortune to make the decoration nothing short of exquisite. Inside, there were paintings by the artist Charles Touchet, who spent a whole year designing the frescoes that adorned the brothel. As you can imagine, not just anyone could access the pleasures of Le Chabanais. The brothel was reserved only for the wealthiest elite men on the continent. In the 19th century, when the brothel had just opened its doors, its most famous visitor was the Prince of Wales, who would become King Edward VII of England. It is said that he was a regular client of the brothel, and his favorite room was the Hindu room, as it contained a curious object. It was the love chair, a seat where the prince could recline and have sex with 2 women at the same time. It was designed to support his weight and not crush his partners in the act, as the prince was a very corpulent man. Decades later, the love chair would become one of the favorite toys of the Nazis. It is currently for sale, and you can watch the curator talking about it here.
So it's a siège d'amour, or love chair. It was used by Edward VII of England before he became king. In his younger years, he liked to run off to Paris to frolic with women, ladies of the night, if you will. So it was designed for his personal use at Le Chabanais, one of the most notorious brothels of Paris. It dates to about 1890, and it could be yours.
During the occupation, only the most important officers of the Wehrmacht, including those who managed the destiny of the Nazi Empire, entered this brothel. This is how Hermann Göring became the most renowned client during this time. Hitler's lieutenant, enjoyed losing himself for hours inside Le Chabanais, taking champagne baths in a copper bathtub, and indulging in the love chair of Prince Edward VII. The common troops had to make do with the rest of the brothels in Paris, which obviously were not as luxurious. As for the prostitutes, they were delighted to serve the Germans. They soon discovered that many rumors about the treatment of German men towards women were unfounded. At the beginning of the invasion, it was said that they were violent, aggressive, and irascible. In other words, replicas of the Führer. As the weeks passed, the prostitutes realized that they were actually like any other men, at least in private. In fact, some even came to prefer them over the French, as the rumor spread that the Germans were more cultured, courteous, and generous. Years after World War II, Fabienne Jamais, a madam of that time, wrote her memoirs. In them, she recounts her experience during those times and says the following: "I remember those SS soldiers, all dressed in black, all so young and beautiful, often endowed with extraordinary intelligence. They even knew how to speak French and English." On another occasion, seeing that some of her favorite clients were about to leave Paris to go to the front lines, she told them the following: "You're crazy. You're going to kill yourselves. Let Hitler go to fight instead of you." Many prostitutes became involved in intense relationships with the invaders. As we mentioned earlier, for many of them, it was a way to have a patron who provided protection and security. Although the prostitutes experienced the Nazi occupation as a golden age, the truth is that for the rest of the population, things were very different. The oppression of the German government became unbearable, and this situation reached its limit during the final stages of the war, when misery engulfed Europe. In this context, the prostitutes began to be singled out as collaborators of the regime. It was said that they were practicing horizontal collaboration, a play on words to emphasize that they exchanged sexual favors for well-being. Although this was exaggerated, and most were just doing their job, none of it mattered. For the French people, these women were as guilty as the worst Nazi leaders and deserved punishment. The situation was about to reach its climax. By June 1944, the enemies of fascism initiated the liberation of France, a maneuver where the resistance played a prominent role. Shortly thereafter, in August, the German soldiers stationed in Paris surrendered, opening the doors to the Allies. This way, the French nation regained its independence. The leaders of the Vichy regime were brought to trial for treason. The most brutal sentence was reserved for the Prime Minister, Pierre Laval, who was the real leader of the state. On October 15, 1945, he was sentenced to death, led before a firing squad, and executed. The government that emerged after the liberation of France put an end to the system of brothels run by the Nazis. Now the situation had taken a 180-degree turn. The prostitutes, who were once the most benefited by the occupation, now found themselves in the eye of the storm. There was an enraged population ready to mete out justice by their own hands and avenge the times of abuse and impunity. The supposed collaborators of Hitler were subjected to a brutal witch hunt, and the prostitutes were among the most affected by it. In those chaotic days, the streets were filled with furious crowds, relentlessly pursuing the women accused of collaboration. Once caught, they were held by several people, while a knife was passed over their heads, shaving them completely bald. This punishment dates back to the Middle Ages and was a way to humiliate unfaithful women. Their hair, considered their most characteristic attribute, and their main tool of seduction, was taken away. Here you can see one of the victims being carried as a trophy. However, the punishments did not end here. The most unfortunate were beaten until they were covered in bruises and bleeding from dozens of wounds. Then, They were loaded onto a truck and paraded throughout Paris so that citizens could insult, spit, and boo them. No one could have imagined that one of the prostitutes from Le Chabanais, which until recently was one of the most exclusive places in the French city, would now be humiliated in such a way. The story of the most famous brothel in Paris came to an end in 1946, when the government ordered the closure of all brothels. In 1951, the assets of the site were sold at an auction, resulting in the public learning the truth about what happened inside. This is how the most scandalous details about the themed rooms and objects, like the love chair of Edward VII, came to light. Today, where Le Chabanais used to operate, there is a residential building for private use. There are no traces left of what once was a pleasure haven for Nazi leaders. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, do you believe that French prostitutes were truly collaborators with Nazism? Leave your answer in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.